All right, let's talk about the economy. For a lot of us, that word just conjures up these super complicated charts, right? And experts talking in a language that, well, it feels like we're not supposed to understand. But what if I told you it's actually not that complicated? Today, we're going to break down how the economic machine really works, and we're going to use the incredible framework from investor Ray Dalio to do it. And really, this quote just hits the nail on the head, doesn't it? It feels like economics is often made to be intimidating, almost on purpose. But Dalio's whole point is that once you pull back the curtain, what you find underneath is actually pretty simple. It's logical. It makes sense. And that's the big idea we're running with today. The economy isn't some kind of mysterious, unknowable force of nature. No, it's just a machine with a few basic parts and a couple of really important cycles. And once you see how those parts click together, honestly, the whole thing starts to become clear. So here's the plan. We'll start with the machine and its parts, then dig into the power of credit. We'll look at the short-term and long-term debt cycles, see what happens when the machine breaks, and finish up with 3 simple rules for success. Let's jump in. All right, section 1, the machine and its parts. So to really get a handle on the big picture, we've got to start small. I mean, like the smallest, most fundamental piece of the entire economic puzzle. And that tiny little piece? It's the transaction. Seriously, think of it like the atom of the economy. Every single time you buy a coffee, pay your phone bill, or even buy a share of stock, that's a transaction. Billions and billions of these things are happening every single day. And when you put them all together, they create the engine that drives everything. And it really is this simple. You've got a buyer, they give money or credit to a seller, the seller gives them goods, services, or assets. That's it. It doesn't matter if you're buying a candy bar or a skyscraper, the basic mechanic is exactly the same. And when you add up all that spending in all the different markets, poof, you have an economy. Every single one of those transactions is like a tiny drop of fuel in the tank. Okay, so while all of us are out there making transactions, the biggest players in the game are governments. But the single most powerful player, that's the central bank. You can really think of them as the puppeteers pulling the strings of the economy. They don't do a ton of buying and selling themselves, but they control the whole flow of money and credit. And they do it with 2 main levers: setting interest rates and, when things get really hairy, printing money. Which brings us perfectly to our next topic, the power of credit. And you got to understand, this is probably the most important part of the economy, but it's also the most volatile. It's like strapping a turbocharger onto the economic engine. It lets things go way, way faster. And this right here is the simple, powerful idea that makes the whole thing work. Your spending is someone else's income. Just think about that for a second. Every dollar you spend, someone else earns. So when credit is easy to get, you can spend more. That means someone else's income goes up. And because their income is higher, they look better to lenders, so they can borrow more and spend more. And you can see how this creates a powerful, self-reinforcing cycle. And check this out, because this is where it gets kind of mind-blowing. Look at the difference here. In an economy like the United States, the amount of credit absolutely dwarfs the amount of actual cash floating around. We're talking multiple times more credit than money. So what does that really mean? It means credit isn't just some sideshow. For all practical purposes, credit is the economy. It's the fuel for almost all the spending. So this is the mental model that Dalio gives us, and it's brilliant. That straight line you see, that's productivity growth. It's the slow, steady march upwards we get from learning things and building better stuff. But that wavy line, that's reality. That's what our economy actually looks like with credit. See, credit lets us spend more than we produce for a while. It's like we're borrowing from our future selves. But eventually, the bill comes due, and we have to pay it back. That's what creates the downturns. That's what creates these cycles. Okay, so let's zoom in on that first wave, the short-term debt cycle. This is the one you're probably most familiar with, right? It's the one we're always hearing about in the news. It typically plays out over about 5 to 8 years. And here's how it usually goes. First, with credit flowing, spending and incomes are rising. Everyone's feeling good. But pretty soon, demand starts to outgrow supply, and prices start to go up. That's inflation. So the central bank steps in, they raise interest rates to make borrowing more expensive and kind of tap the brakes. This works, people borrow less, spending slows down, and the economy cools off. Maybe even a little too much, risking a recession. So what do then? You guessed it, they lower interest rates to get people borrowing and spending again. And the whole cycle starts all over. It's this constant balancing act. But here's the thing. Hiding underneath all those little 5 to 8 year cycles is a much bigger, much slower, and frankly, much more dangerous wave. We're talking about the long-term debt cycle. This isn't something that plays out in a few years. This one builds over generations, 50, 75, even 100 years. So over decades and decades of these short-term cycles, something happens. Each peak gets a little higher than the last. You have the boom phase on the left. Incomes are going up, house prices are soaring, everyone feels rich. So naturally, they borrow more and more. It feels great. But eventually, you cross a line. You enter the bubble phase on the right. This is where debt starts growing way faster than income. People are literally taking on new debt just to make payments on their old debt. The whole thing has gone from a healthy boom to a fragile bubble, just waiting to pop. So, what happens when that giant generational bubble finally pops? Well, this is when the machine completely breaks down. The technical term is a deleveraging, and it's exactly what the world went through in 2008. It's what Japan went through back in the early 90s. It's a big, big deal. And the dominoes fall incredibly fast. First, the bubble pops. Asset prices, stocks, houses, they just plummet. This wipes out everybody's collateral, so lenders totally panic, and credit just freezes solid. Nobody can borrow. So of course, spending grinds to a halt. And remember, one person's spending is another's income. So incomes collapse. Now, the central bank tries to save the day. They slash interest rates, but they hit zero, and it's still not enough. Their main tool is now useless. The debt is just too big. And what you get is this long, painful recovery that can take a decade or more, what people often call a lost decade. So when cutting interest rates all the way to zero doesn't work, policymakers are backed into a corner. They have one last, very controversial, very risky option left. They have to print money. And this is precisely what the Federal Reserve did in the US after 2008. They created trillions of dollars out of thin air to buy up assets, to basically force-feed money into the system and try to get the machine restarted. It's a huge gamble because it can lead to other problems down the road. But when you're in a mess this big, sometimes it's the only option you've got. Okay, so after all that, the booms, the busts, the crashes, it sounds pretty scary, right? So how are we supposed to navigate all this? Well, this is where Dalio brings it all home. He boils everything down to 3 beautiful, simple rules for how to manage the economy and keep it healthy over the long haul. And here they are. They're so simple. Rule number 1, don't let debt grow faster than income. Why? Because that's how you get those dangerous bubbles. Rule 2, don't let income grow faster than productivity, because if you're not actually creating more value, you're just making yourself less competitive. And rule number 3, the most important one of all, do everything you possibly can to raise productivity, because at the end of the day, that is the only thing that actually makes us all wealthier and improves our lives in the long run. And that's our look at the economic machine. You now have the simple but powerful framework. You understand the transactions, you see the power of credit, and you know about the 2 big cycles that are always at play. So, I'll leave you with a question to chew on. Now that you have this lens, where do you think we are in the cycle right now? And what does that tell you about what might be just around the corner?